program. That's a Tuesday evening. It will be at the library at 6:30, and we'll have Kylie McCormick coming to talk about the Wyoming state flag. Tonight we are dealing with a rather difficult and emotional topic, and for that, we especially appreciate you coming. We also, very gentle reminder to stay respectful as far as comments, questions, and if you have a cell phone, turn it to silent, please. If you do need to leave before the program is over, I just ask that you duck out that back door and go around. And to introduce our speaker, he's semi-retired, has taught at a variety of colleges with different classes. I attended one of his classes myself a number of years ago. And his classes include the history of genocide. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome John Egan.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin tonight with a central idea. The Nazis wanted to silence Jewish voices forever. They failed, but at a horrendous cost. 6 million is the number, and is often too large to comprehend. Yet, that number represents 6 million individual lives destroyed. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
If you saw the poster, you saw this beautiful young woman on the poster. And she was one of those 6 million lives that was lost. This is Ilse Scharf. She was only 22 when she died at Auschwitz. Her story is similar to so many others, yet different. She was born in Karlsruhe, Germany. Her father had served in World War I, and he was fluent in French, and he became a wine merchant, and he traveled frequently to France. Probably most of the family was French-speaking. She went to a Catholic school in the 1930s because the Catholic schools, at least in Karlsruhe, did not enforce the racial divisions that the Nazis were beginning to implement. So perhaps when she went to school, she was spared some of the anti-Semitism that other Jewish children experienced in Germany. As things got worse, her father and her uncle shared in the business, and her uncle signed over his share of the business and went to America. Her father stayed in Germany. Eventually, they sent her older brother to study in England, and they were desperate to begin to get visas for themselves. Her mother's sister lived in Argentina. They tried to get any way to get out, and they couldn't. Eventually, the war started. The Jews of southwestern Germany were first deported to Gurs in France, and they went to a concentration camp there that had no sanitation, no running water, almost no food at all. Yet that was still better than what awaited them. In their last year at the concentration camp in France, they still wrote to her aunt, trying to get to South America. They were unable to, and in 1942, they were deported from Drancy in Paris to Auschwitz, and all three, mother, father, and daughter, perished on the mountain. The question I ask you is that every single person deported from Drancy was recorded. What is the responsibility of each and every one of us? There were typists who sat and aided in the entire process. A mere typist, perhaps a young woman, just doing her job for the day. You see Hélène, Elsa, and Julia Scharf, numbers 21, 22, and 23. 1,000 people were deported on this train. By 1945, only 5 had survived. How do you get to a point where you will tolerate and even encourage, with some people, the Nazis themselves, this mass slaughter of millions of people. It'll take a moment. I'd like to look at the history of the Jewish people in Europe. In 70 AD or 770 CE, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. There were numerous revolts against the Roman occupiers, but more and more the Jewish people were forced out of ancient Palestine and driven to the four corners of the world at that time. One of the long-standing sources of violence between Christians and Jews is the blood libel that has been claimed against the Jews, that Jews have desecrated the sacraments and the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. Here you have a wood print from the Nuremberg Chronicles in the Middle Ages showing the burning of Jews. At various times, most countries in the Middle Ages and early modern era deported the Jews. Jews were not citizens, Jews were not subjects, Jews were simply outsiders. Probably the most famous deportation was after the Spanish Inquisition in Spain in the 1490s. And at that time, the ruler of Poland was very tolerant. And so Jews from throughout Europe, and you see the area of Poland in pink, fled to wherever they could go. They went to North Africa, they went to the Ottoman Empire, and they went to Poland. Here is a law from the French Revolution, the law subject to the Jews of France. This is the first time in 1791 that Jews become citizens and have the rights of citizens. Largely it was carried through, were lost throughout the 19th century. But what happened was you had two movements develop in Europe amongst Jews. Here you have Alice, the Rothschild, and the Rothschilds were affluent and they mixed well in the larger society. And you see that there's a great deal of acculturation that she's wearing the clothes of the Victorian era. But especially in Eastern Europe, you had the shtetl and you had traditional Hasidic Jews. And so you have within Judaism a division between those Jews who were acculturated to the larger Western society and those Jews who preserved an insular culture. By the time we get to the late 1800s, in fact the 1890s, you had a major crisis erupt in France. France, of all places, the country that gave Jews full citizenship, the first country to do that. And you had the Dreyfus affair, or Dreyfus in German, and a captain in the French army was accused of treason and sending secrets to the Germans. As it turned out, he was innocent, but there was a trial, he was convicted, he lost his commission in the French army, he was shipped off to Devil's Island to be imprisoned for life. He was finally exonerated, but not after the French officer knew it was over. Here's the front page of a French newspaper, and he's attacking the president of France. J'accuse. I am accusing you. And, of course, not surprisingly, Jews were questioning, well, if this can happen in France, it can happen anywhere. And so you have the emergence of Zionism at the same time as the Dreyfus affair. You have Theodor Herzl who says, no, Jews don't have a place in Europe. We need to find a homeland for Jews. And again, you have a division within European Judaism. Likewise, at this time, you have ongoing pogroms, which are massacres in Russia particularly. And the Tsarist government of Russia actually used pogroms to divert attention from all of their shortcomings. And they allowed Jews to be rounded up and slaughtered. In the case of the Bialystok pogrom, about 80 Jews were murdered and about 80 others were severely injured. And this was, I think, in 1906. I think this picture is especially tragic. This is Willy Ehrmann, and he was a soldier in the Kaiser's army. He was German, and he served Germany. His family was very much acculturated, and he served in World War I on the front lines in the trenches. It wasn't enough. Once Hitler came to power, it didn't matter that he had served in his country. He was shipped to Auschwitz, and he was gassed in 1943. World War I was devastating to German culture. Up until World War I, Germany had unified. It became one of the strongest industrial and military powers in the world, and many Germans could not understand how they could possibly have lost the war. And so one explanation that was put forward was that Germany was stabbed in the back. And who did the stabbing in the back? Jews. Germany would have won if it hadn't been for the Jews. And so you have this growing resentment. Now the resentment, we've got 2,000 years of hatred of Jews that's just barely under the surface. And so now it's coming back to the forefront. Complicating matters further, Germany's economy totally collapsed in the 1920s. The term is hyperinflation. And yet, at one point in time, I believe that a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. And yet again, the finger is pointed towards the Jews. Do you all know how Hitler came to power? How did Hitler come to power?
Promising.
He was elected. Hitler was elected. Germany had been through a period in the Weimar Republic of instability. In 1932, the Nazi Party became the largest party in the November election of 1932. In 1933, in February, I believe it was, March, there was a second election in which they became even more powerful. He was appointed chancellor, and just at the same time, a young communist radical set the Reichstag on fire, dem Deutschenbote. This is like somebody burning down the United States Capitol. And Hitler claimed that it was necessary to set the German Constitution aside and give him extraordinary powers. And finally, in November of 1933, there was yet another election. How many parties were on the ballot in that election? One party. Very quickly, Jews began to be marginalized in German society. And you had the passage of the Nuremberg laws. These laws had two effects. They defined who was and who wasn't a Jew. Germans were part of society and Jews were not. And Jews were not defined by religion. Jews were defined by race. And if you look at this chart, it has all of these dimensions as to who would be considered a Jew or somebody with German blood, and then in between are the Mischlinge. Probably a horrible translation of that is half-breed. Not only did you have a racial definition of Jews, but also Jews lost their citizenship. Jews in Germany from this point on were simply subjects. They had no longer any rights as Germans. In fact, Because they had been Germans, after they lost their German citizenship, they were stateless. They were citizens of no country. You also have the beginning of the loss of Jews' ability to earn a living. You have a sign there that says, Germans, protect yourself, don't buy from Jews. And these are being placed on Jewish shop windows by the brown shirts of the SA. Similarly, legally, Jews could no longer work in the professions. Jews who were doctors, Jews who were professors, were kicked out of their jobs. Germany begins under Hitler its expansion, and the first place where it expanded was Austria. Austria is German-speaking, and after the war, Austria claimed that it was Hitler's first victim. No, it was not. No, Austria was not. This is the Anschluss, and in the Anschluss, Hitler marched into Austria, and if you can see by the crowds, they were delighted to have Hitler annex Austria to Germany. 250,000 Jews were in Austria. There were 500,000 Jews in Germany, and many of the Jews in Austria had fled from Germany to try, to protect themselves from what was happening in Germany, and now they had been sucked back into Germany again. I wish I could find again, it was probably 20 years ago, where I found I believe it was a Bavarian Jewish newspaper, and there were a number of letters back and forth. It was in the mid-30s. And some of the people were writing and they're saying, this Hitler guy, he's a flash in the pan, he's ignorant, just wait him out, he'll be gone. And then you had others who were saying, no, he's very dangerous and it's serious. That was a normal kind of discussion around people. If you had your life's business and your family in a community, are you going to just pick up and leave immediately? Well, by 1938, that discussion was no longer going on. And people were desperate to get out. The world held a conference in Evian, in France, the Evian Conference. There was only one Jewish representative, Golda Meir, from Palestine, and yet she was a non-voting observer. And all of these diplomats got together, and they were supposed to find a way of opening the doors and allowing more visas and permits so that Jews could escape from Germany. One country in the entire world opened their doors, the Dominican Republic, and they gave a few dozen visas out. Evian is an example of total failure on the part of the most exalted and the finest diplomats the world can offer, and they accomplished nothing. Meanwhile, conditions deteriorate even further for Jews in Germany. Because there were stateless Jews in Germany, particularly those who weren't even born in Germany. Many of the German Jews had been born in Russian Poland in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and Germany deported them to the border. Poland wouldn't accept them, and so you had thousands of people trapped on the German-Polish border. The son of one of those people trapped went to Paris, shot and killed a German diplomat. And in Germany, Himmler and Goebbels demanded that Jews pay. And you had Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And in the period of 36 hours, Jewish shops all across Germany were smashed and looted. Hundreds and hundreds of synagogues were burned to the ground. And who was blamed? The Jews were blamed. And the Jews were required to pay for the damage. And Jewish businessmen that were marched off and they were shipped. You had the beginning of concentration camps. And many of the top Jewish leaders in Germany were shipped to Dachau. Hitler expands further. There was a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, and he demanded from the Western powers that he be allowed to annex this region of Czechoslovakia to Germany. And he said it was going to be his last demand. So Jews had also attempted to flee to Czechoslovakia. It was the last democracy left in Central Europe. The Western powers met. Britain, particularly Neville Chamberlain, France, Italy, and Germany, to decide Czechoslovakia's fate at the Munich conference. Was Czechoslovakia there? No. Czechoslovakia wasn't there, and they were being sliced up. And in the Munich conference, Hitler was awarded the Sudetenland, and Neville Chamberlain came back in the famous picture of Neville Chamberlain getting off the airplane in London saying, "We have peace in our times." Peace bought at a very, very high price. Many of you may not know the story of the MS St. Louis. By now we're in 1939, and the Jews who are still in Germany, about half of the Jews had found a way to get out, but the Jews who were still in Germany were desperate to leave. And those who got tickets on the MS St. Louis were so relieved. They paid a bribe to Cuba to get entry visas into Cuba. And they took the ship to Cuba, and the pictures from the days they were on the ship crossing the Atlantic, people were so relieved. And there were dinners and parties, and people were strolling on the deck. They had escaped. When the ship got to Cuba, Cuba refused to let the passengers get off. And the ship was forced to return to Europe. Did not go back to Germany. France and Netherlands and Belgium and Britain all divided up the passengers. Only about a quarter of them went to Britain. 3/4 of them went back to the continent. Fritz Buff, who the pictures of him with practically every other girl on the boat. Fritz Buff managed to get to America. Ilse Karliner did not. France took Ilse Karliner in and her family. This is in the spring of 1939. In the spring of 1942, she was shipped from Wannsee on a transport to Auschwitz and was murdered. I want to ask you, the very last thing before war broke out was something called the Kindertransport, the children's transport. What would it take? I know we have a mostly older audience. There are some younger people, too, younger parents. What would it take for you to put your children or your grandchildren on a train that was going 1,000 miles away, knowing you would probably never see them again? What would it take for you to do that? And yet, these children who are arriving in London, I believe, they were saved. At such a high cost. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. I actually write newspapers when they publish something that says, war broke out. No, war did not break out. Germany invaded Poland deliberately. And in fact, the Nazi leadership in Germany had lists of people from the very beginning who they were going to murder. Jews and non-Jews. They particularly wanted to destroy the leadership, the professors, priests, political leaders, businessmen. Another German term I'll use, Lebensraum. And the Nazi Party in particular believed that Germany needed to have more space for its people. And that space would come at the east and at the expense of the Polish and other peoples. And so from the very beginning, it's not something that developed later, from the very beginning, World War II was a war of slaughter on the part of the Nazi German leadership. The following spring, in June of 1940, France fell. I know my father used to say, I remember hearing on the radio, it was announced that France fell. People all over the world were shocked and devastated. But for the Jews and France in these intervening years, I told you that Ilse Scharf's family, had traveled to France frequently. France accepted many Jews from Germany who were refugees. But now they were trapped in France after France fell. And what's worse, a German was considered also an enemy alien. So they were doubly trapped in France once France fell. I'd like to tell you a story about somebody else, because I think it's important to know that we're talking about people and people's lives. This is Meyer Nieding. He was from the Netherlands. He was an insurance salesman. Here you see him with his newborn daughter. In the Netherlands fell at about the same time that France did, in the spring of 1940. And Jews gradually lost their rights, had to report, had to wear the yellow star, and were ultimately rounded up to a transit camp called Westerbork. And Meyer Nieding, he was deported to Auschwitz. He lied when he was on the selection platform. He said he was a farm worker because he probably understood that his chance of survival was better if he said that he was a farm worker rather than saying he was an insurance salesman. He managed to live about 6 months like other inmates who were held for forced labor or slave labor. He had the Auschwitz identification number tattooed on his arm. He died, probably most people in Auschwitz, and it was planned, calories that you could eat, the amount of food you had. It was understood that most people wouldn't last more than 1, 2, or 3 months. And he died a number of months later, and he's one of the very few people who has an actual death certificate from Auschwitz. The Holocaust writer Elie Wiesel once said, "It is true that not all victims were Jews, but all of the Jews were victims." And here you see a man, his granddaughter published an article that was on BBC this week, telling of her visit to Auschwitz, trying to find the places where he had once stayed. Particularly in the East, there was a huge difference between Jews who lived in the East and Jews who lived in the West. The chance of surviving was better if you were in France or the Netherlands, and your chance of surviving if you were in Poland was practically nil. But in the East, the Germans began to set up ghettos in the various cities. One of the first ghettos they established was Terezin, or Theresienstadt, and what's today the Czech Republic, because that was one of the first regions that the Nazis seized. And you had an ancient Austrian fortress where ultimately close to 200,000 people were forced into an area no bigger than downtown Buffalo. The Germans advertised in Germany that it was a retirement area and a spa, and sold apartments and housing to Jews who were going to be deported there. The city of Łódź, and if you look at it if you see it written, it's spelled L-O-D-Z, but it's pronounced Łódź. The city of Łódź in Poland also had another ghetto that was directed by Chaim Rumpowski. In Łódź, again, Jews were ordered. There would be placards placed all around the city. All Jews are allowed 50 kilos of luggage and must report to the ghetto by noon on Saturday. Any Jew found outside of the ghetto after that time will be shot. And the ghettos were walled off, and the food allocation, especially the food allocation, was going to be 200 calories per person per day. And so, not surprisingly, this is the Warsaw Ghetto, where there were 500,000 people forced into the tiny confounds of the ghetto. These are two women who were dying on the street. A potato was priceless. And yet, Jews were not dying fast enough for the Nazi leadership. The wars expanded even more in the East when Germany invades the Soviet Union in June of 1941. And the Western Soviet Union had millions of Jews. In July of 41, in the Polish-Ukrainian city of Lviv, you had a pogrom that was encouraged by the Nazi conquerors. The pogrom itself, the killing, took place mostly by Ukrainians. In fact, if you look at this horrible picture, you see children chasing this woman. And the Nazis encouraged, they were collaborators. And to this day, many of the Eastern European countries, Poland in particular, but Ukraine as well, Latvia, deny their responsibility. There would not have been a Holocaust if it was just a few very extreme, true believer Nazis. The Nazis received assistance. This is perhaps one of the most well-known pictures of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. The Germans created these military units, quasi-military units, called Einsatzgruppen. And they followed behind the German armies as they were sweeping into the Soviet Union. And the Einsatzgruppen had only one purpose, and that was to seek out and murder Jews. The German army, after the war, said, we had nothing to do with it. But the army had a lot to do with it. The army was absolutely responsible for the areas of action where these Einsatzgruppen killed Jews. Perhaps the most famous case was in Kiev. And this is actually a color photograph taken in October of 1941. You know, you hear people say, well, why did the Jews go to their death and many of them go to their death like sheep? When you see a bulletin post that says, all Jews report by noon on Saturday for forced labor, do you follow that? Because it says below that the penalty for not reporting is death. So those are your choices. And it really helps if somebody, I'm sure, that the SS unit, this SS soldier who shot this man was actually glad that he could do that, because if you have a dead person lying on the side of the street, people are going to follow your orders. And in Kiev, you have the murder of 30,000 Jews in Babi Yar. Babi Yar, and I'm using a picture from another ghetto area in Ukraine. Babi Yar is the large ravine outside of Kiev. And the people were lined up and marched to the edge of the ravine, forced to undress, and then they were pushed into the ravine and shot in the ravine. And this is a small community, a small ghetto in Ukraine where the Jews were murdered. In Babi Yar, the bodies were layer upon layer upon layer. 30,000 people who were shot in a period of 3 days. And yet, for the Nazi leadership, it was not fast enough, and it was also possibly too difficult. It was too difficult for their soldiers doing the shooting, and it might also become public. And so you have what is called the final solution to the Jewish question. The very idea of Jewish question. There's no Jewish question to begin with. But the final solution, and it's a horrible euphemism. In January of 1942, all of the major divisions of the German government and the Nazi Party sent representatives to a conference in Wannsee. There were directives that were written out for this conference. One set of directives, they were supposed to be all destroyed. One set survived. Including here, you have a listing of all the Jews. The A category is the countries that Germany already occupies. The B category are countries that Germany doesn't occupy at present. You see that England is the second one. Had Germany have conquered England, there are 330,000 Jews listed on this list, they would have met the same fate. There's absolutely no question from the documentation from Wannsee that at this point now that the Nazi German government wants to murder every Jew in Europe. At the same time, the way of killing Jews has changed. You have the creation of 5, and Cello's the 6th, Vernichtungslager. Not concentration camps, but extermination camps. When people talk about Auschwitz, and Auschwitz was the most western camp down in what had been German Silesia and later Polish Silesia, Auschwitz had some other purposes, but its primary purpose was for the destruction of European Jews. Ooh. I don't even know how I can begin to talk about this. It's extremely, extremely difficult. This is the leader of the Łódź Ghetto. And I believe this is a picture when he made his famous "Give me your children" speech. You see, there's only so many calories, and you don't get to eat unless you're working. And Rumkowski thought that if they produced uniforms for the German army and became indispensable, that they would not be destroyed. And every month, the Germans would demand more people for the transports to the extermination camps. And the Germans then asked for all children to be handed over. And here's what Rumkowski said. A grievous blow has been struck the ghetto. They are asking us to give up the best we possess, the children and the elderly. I never imagined I would be forced to deliver this sacrifice to the altar with my own hands in my old age. I must stretch out my hands and beg, brothers and sisters, hand them over to me. Give me your children, fathers and mothers. Give me your children. No one had any doubt where those children were going. Of course, the parents didn't. And Rumkowski's ghetto police went from building to building to building, dragging the children out and putting them on the transports to Chelmno and the gas chambers. In the case of Warsaw, the leader of the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw, Adam Chernyakov, when he was ordered to deliver the children, he took his life. He refused to sign the order. Now, in Warsaw, deportations were taking place as well. And everyone eventually knew where, because the trains would leave in the morning and come back empty in the afternoon. People knew what was happening. Yet in Warsaw, the choice was either to die in the gas chambers or to die in the rubble. And in April and May of 1943, you had the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And the last few Jews, and particularly these were young Jews, the last few Jews who remained in the ghetto fought back against the Germans. They were fighting tanks and planes and artillery with a couple of hand grenades and a few pistols. But they fought back until the ghetto was absolutely and totally annihilated. These are the children of Terezin. Did you see the paintings and other artwork the children did before the program began? The Germans advertised Terezin as a model ghetto. And the Red Cross kept asking, well, we need to visit. The International Red Cross said, we need to visit. And they gussied it up. They gave people more food. They cleaned it up, they painted it. They even had, when the Red Cross officials came, they even had the children put on a program and they staged a soccer match. And the Red Cross went back and they said to the world, it's not that bad. It looks pretty good to us. It was the greatest failure of the Red Cross in its history. Soon after this picture was taken, these children were deported to Auschwitz and gassed. Hannah Brady is well known for a children's book that was written about 20 years ago, Hannah Brady's Suitcase. Hannah Brady, I think, was 13 when she was deported from Terezin to Auschwitz. She had grown up in Moravia, in Czechoslovakia. Her parents were deported before she and her brother were. So when she and her brother arrived in Terezin, they were orphans. If you were an orphan, your chances of survival were much less. And she was deported to Auschwitz and gassed upon arrival. Her older brother survived, the only member of his family who did survive. I want to talk to you also about, if I said the International Red Cross failed, and it did, Pope Pius XII. The debate is significant as to his role in the Holocaust. And Helen Keller, if you know the American philanthropist and scholar Helen Keller, who was deaf and blind. Helen Keller knew in the early years of the war, and she wrote about the mass murder of Jews. And it could be said that without the benefit of sight or hearing, Helen Keller knew what was going on, and she was also a continent away. And yet the Pope in Rome, with a priest in every village across Europe, did not. In Germany, 80% of the Protestants formed the German church, the Deutsches Kirche, and recognized Adolf Hitler as the leader. But there were voices that attempted to resist what was going on. The Berlin priest Bernhard Lichtenberg, he, during Kristallnacht, said from the altar, they are burning houses of God when they burn the synagogues in the city. And every time he had a service, he asked the congregation to remember what is happening to the Jews. In 1943, he was warned, and in 1943, he went before a German summary court, and he was convicted of treason. He was sentenced to Dachau, and while he was being shipped to Dachau, he died of a heart attack. The middle person is Sophie Scholl, and she was a member of a student resistance group called White Rose. And she heard from her brother on the Eastern Front what was going on. And they actually published flyers that said, "Do you know what is happening in the name of the German people? We are going to pay a high price for this." Sophie Scholl, her brother, and other members of the White Rose group were discovered. Of course, the Nazis and the secret police were searching for them. They were uncovered, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. And the third person here is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And he was a German theologian, and he believed that there came a time where you had to speak out. Silence was no longer acceptable. He had been in New York City and said that he must return to Germany. His friends and colleagues were begging him to stay in the United States, and he said he must return to Germany. He continued to speak out against Nazism in Germany. He was sent to Dachau, and in the very last weeks of the war, he was executed. There is a single collection of photographs from the Auschwitz extermination camp. It's called the Auschwitz album. It was found by Lily Jacob. And Lily Jacob was an 18-year-old Jew from Ruthenia, which was at that time a far area, easternmost province of Czechoslovakia. Her family had been deported to Auschwitz in late May of 1944, and she had been selected for slave labor. She survived. She had typhus, was very ill. She had been forced on a death march and managed to survive and was in a recovery center, a field hospital that had been formerly an SS barracks. And as she was recovering, she discovered a package in a cabinet next to her bed, and when she undid the package, it was a photo album. And it is one of the most amazing coincidences in history, I think, because not only was it a photo album of a transport from when they arrived in Auschwitz until they were standing before the gas chambers, it was the transport of her village. So let me just, this is extremely painful because the photographer was clearly German and had no concern for the people he was photographing. So do bear that in mind as we go through these pictures, please. Here you have the trains arriving on the platform or the ramp. And if you look, this is the train that Lily Jacob is arriving on. And this is a train that has been there just before. So in the morning, 1,000 Jews have been killed this day. And now it's just afternoon, and another train with another 1,000 Jews is pulled in. From Benahovo in Ruthenia, it probably took 3 or 4 days for this train to get there. there would be 100 people in each of the cattle cars with one bucket of water and perhaps one bucket for sanitation. And so when the doors opened and people were, there was probably an immense sense of relief. I have to put my glasses on here. Here you see people, and they're jumping out of the cattle car. Families, people of all ages. I would like for you to take a look at the letters that are stenciled on the side of that car. Do you see the SNCF? Do you know what SNCF stands for? It stands for Société Nationale du Chemin de Fer, the French National Railroad. It's a week before D-Day. Every single German military person knows that the Allies are going to be invading France anytime soon. And Germany is using French railroad equipment to ship Jews to Auschwitz. Which is more important? Which is more important? Sending critical needed troops and supplies to France or shipping Jews to Auschwitz? At this point, you have SS officers on the platform saying the famous German word, schnell, schnell, fast, fast. Don't worry about your luggage. Your luggage will be delivered to you later.
Yeah.
We have the benefit of history. I can look at this photo and you can look at this photo too. Do you know which of these people survived? These women clearly didn't. They're too old. And the little children there, they didn't survive because they were too young. The only person who survived was this young teenage girl. You can look at the photos and almost guess. By now, the people on the transport are forming in two lines. The men are to form over here, and the women and children are to form over here. They see these people who are in prison uniforms, and they're wondering, even sees one woman waving at somebody she knows. So there's this period of chaos. Finally, the lines are formed, and you can see the entrance gate to Auschwitz here in the distance. And you see the SS officers in front. Quite often, one of the officers who would be doing the selection was Joseph Mengele. And it varied, people say, from the right or left, and it depended which way you were. Sometimes there were two sets of lines and people in the middle. But you had 10 seconds, and your fate was decided. Here, very clearly, these two young women have been selected for slave labor. And I have little doubt that the man who's at the front of the line, that young man, would have been selected for slave labor too. You have this woman who was probably selected for labor as well, and she's looking back. This is the last time she sees her family. This boy is very fortunate. The boy is fortunate because he's standing in the line with men. He has a chance to survive. This is probably the single most famous portrait of selection at Auschwitz. And you see this woman with a baby. And perhaps one of the inmates had whispered to her, "Give the baby to your mother. Give the baby to your mother." And she may have said to the officer in front, Do I have to give up my baby? And the officer would have said something like, oh, ma'am, no, you do not. We would never do that to you. If you would like to go to this direction, please do so. And she's a fairly young woman, but by her keeping the baby, she's going to die. You see also a man who has lost his pants and one of his shoes, and immediately you have some guards, and you also have some other inmates who are going to circle him, and they will try to calm him down and take him behind one of the barracks and shoot him in silencing. You do not want chaos. It's the last thing the SS officers want. And so in the very next picture, the woman with the baby is gone, and this entire family is also been selected for immediate gassing. It's unlikely that many of these people in this picture survive. The children are with their mothers and grandmothers, too young. You can see that the lines are shrinking by now. There's already a large number of people who are heading towards the gas chambers. In fact, at this very moment, the crematoria fires from the survivors who said when a train arrived, the crematoria would be heated up and the fires would be burning at immense heat in preparation for the 1,000 people who were on the train. For persons with disabilities, for very old people, of course they had. Well, I was going to say, of course, they had no chance to survive. There was one possibility for a dwarf to survive. Josef Mengele, who had not only a medical degree, but he also had a PhD in anthropology. He would select them for medical experiments. Hardly a way to survive. And the old people who could not walk the distance to the gas chambers, they would be simply loaded into a truck and shot and dumped in pits. The next set of photos are of people who are on the ramp headed towards the gas chamber. You can actually see some of the barracks in the background and the electrified fence. They're in a place that obviously you're trying to make sense of what's around you. What is going on? They're exhausted. They haven't had anything to drink for some time. They haven't had anything to eat. And you can see the exhaustion and fear in their faces. And particularly the woman on the left. I think of all the photos that are in this collection, this woman, the fear, the terror shows in her face. Do these people know what's going to happen to them? I don't think so. I mean, the Nazis took advantage of people's desire to possibly think the best. And the SS officers would say, you know, this is not going to be a Sunday school picnic, but you know, if you work, you know, you will survive. And on Sundays, the workers can visit their family in the family camp, if you follow orders. This is a devastating picture, and there's absolutely no doubt that the woman there is the grandmother of these children. And if you look in their very last hour, the grandmother has wrapped her scarf around them, and she has the baby with her. I believe this is 4 generations of the same family. You can see the family resemblance. The great-grandmother is perhaps 85 or 90, and the grandmother is 65, and the mother is 40. She has her 15-year-old daughter. The 15-year-old daughter very likely could have lived. Certainly she could have been selected for slave labor. She chose to stay with her family. And who am I, or who are we to challenge the choice that she made? It would be far too easy for someone to say, well, she made the wrong choice. I can't imagine that. She made the choice that she made. Finally, at the end of that ramp, you have the Birkenau, the birch wood. In fact, this part of Auschwitz had 3 main camps. The killing center was Auschwitz-Birkenau. And it was named after this little small birch forest. So after days of exhaustion and terror, all of a sudden, these people come on a little woods with grass on the ground. And it's right in front of the gas chamber. And so they sit, and they have food tucked away. And they sit, and they relax for a moment. Small children, women, old people. For the Nazi Germans, the war was a war of annihilation. It was a racial war. And Jews, according to Nazi ideology, were absolute enemy of the German people. I want to ask you a question. Is this little girl a threat to Germany? The next 3 photos were taken by the Sonderkommando. Those were the slave laborers who were forced to remove the bodies from the gas chamber and put them in the crematoria or burn them in open pits. And in late July, early August of 1944, when the Jews of Hungary were arriving morning and noon and night, 1,000 per train, the Sonderkommando, someone snuck in a camera. And these people who were working in the crematoria took 4 pictures. One did not come out. This is a picture, and I use this next, even though it's from a different photographer, and it was taken surreptitiously, very quickly, by one of the workers in the Sonderkommando. This is a picture of the women of the transport who are undressing and going into the gas chamber. Now, you may not know this, some of you may, but the gas chamber was disguised as a shower house. And they had signs up there that said things like, cleanliness is next to godliness. And they said it in 7 or 8 languages. And they handed people a string and said, don't forget to tie your 2 shoes together so one of them doesn't get lost. Once they were packed into the shower house, the sealed doors were shut, and SS guards on the roof would dump potassium cyanide crystals in Zyklon B. Now, it would take about 20 minutes to die from asphyxiation from potassium cyanide. And they would run diesel engines to hide the screams of the people dying. Who made the potassium cyanide, the Zyklon B? The company that made Zyklon B makes Bayer aspirin. Do you know that the Jews who were shipped to Auschwitz had to pay for their train tickets? And if they were penniless, the cost of their train tickets was placed against the community? Many German corporations made millions of dollars off of the murder of Jews and others. And those corporations are still in business. And think about that every time you see Bayer aspirin on the shelf of the store when you're about to get aspirin. Here's a picture. This shows you from the angle of where the Sonderkommando took the photo. These bodies are being burnt in pits because the crematorium could not keep up with the number of people who were being cast. I believe the crematorium could only burn 2,000 bodies a day. And the pictures were cropped. It's an argument historically about which is the proper way to display them, but either way, they're overwhelmed. What about for those who were selected for slave labor? By 1944, if you look here, you see that actually most of these men are pretty old. The two men on the left are fairly young, and they have a better chance of surviving, and also because it's July, or no, sorry, this group, it's May, June of 1944. These people have a better chance of surviving. The people who were shipped to Auschwitz and were selected for slave labor in 1942, practically none of them survived. But these people do have a chance, particularly the young people. If you look at the women are younger. Because the men Jewish men had already either been selected out in the communities and put into forced labor brigades on the Eastern Front. The men were processed, and the women were processed, and that involved shaving of head, and particularly the tattooing of the number on your arm. You were no longer a person, you were a number. And in fact, roll call would sometimes last 2 hours at a time in the mornings. It's January, this is the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Can you imagine going outside right now in your pajamas and standing out there for 2 hours? Not moving. Not only was the Holocaust mass murder, but it was also mass larceny. These are all the belongings that the community of Jews brought on the train with them. And they're going to be processed. They're going to be processed in a place called Canada, because the inmates at the time imagined Canada as a place of unbelievable riches. Remember that before they had been deported, a single potato was invaluable. And so when they would hear stories about Canada, they did imagine Canada as a place of unlimited riches. This was a photo taken by the Soviets when the camp was liberated. And this is a warehouse that is filled with countless shoes. In fact, many museums, many Holocaust museums around the world do have requested some of those shoes as part of their display, because each pair of shoes indicates a person who lost their life. Not only that, but the Nazis stole every bit of gold they could take. Why did they force the victims to undress? Humiliation was certainly a part of that. To humiliate a person at the very last moment. But the Nazis also knew that people who were being shipped to who knows where would probably put their last money and their last jewels somewhere in their clothing. And so they would, here you have wedding bands. The Sonderkommando used wire cutters to snap off fingers of the dead so that the wedding bands could be collected. They also used tongs to pull out teeth that had any gold fillings. And the gold was melted down and shipped back to the Reichsbank in Berlin. formed into gold bars, and then the gold bars were shipped to Switzerland. And everybody between Auschwitz and Switzerland was just doing their job. Twins. You said twins. A murmur would go out amongst the prisoners when twins would come off of one of the cattle cars. Twins, twins, twins. Tell Dr. Mengele. And Dr. Mengele actually had a special area of the camp reserved for twins. And the twins did receive much better care in terms of their housing, in terms of their food, but they were subjected to his horrific medical experiments. Dr. Mengele was also fascinated by people, particularly by people with dwarfism. And this is the Auschwitz family from Hungary, and they had 7 sisters, brothers, cousins with dwarfism. They managed to survive, but many did not. The Germans also, the Nazis also had a fascination with, I'll use the word here, Roma and Sinti people. The term gypsy is the term that we probably, those of us my age, and I'm seeing a lot of people my age around here, we learned the term gypsy, but gypsy is a pejorative. And today it's better to use the term Roma or Sinti. And this woman here, she, let me find quickly, excuse me, one slippage here. Erna Lauenberger was born in Berlin, and she moved with her family, extended family, to a gypsy camp in Magdeburg in central Germany. She married, but she did not marry in the church or civilly through authorities. She married another Sinti man, Otto Schmidt. He was taken to Buchenwald, and he was subjected to medical experiments and died there. She had 2 young children. She was summoned repeatedly to the Gestapo headquarters in Magdeburg, was photographed, was measured, and eventually she was shipped to Auschwitz. One of her children died immediately, but gypsies many times were kept in a separate camp in Auschwitz and subjected to medical experiments as well. How she died is not known, but one of the survivors said that she was so devastated and so angry that she was murdered and gassed because she could no longer be used in the experiments. She was, I think, 23 when she died. What were some of the experiments that they did? Well, in this case, this person's arm, they deliberately infected people. And they would use one person who would be the control and one person who would be the subject. Human experimentation. They did this with tuberculosis. They deliberately infected people with tuberculosis to see. With twins, they would perform horrific experiments on one. Can you imagine your twin sister or your twin brother being subjected to these horrific experiments and you not? And ultimately your twin dies. Josef Mengele escaped and ended up in Brazil. But most of the doctors in most of the camps, and these experiments took place in many, many camps, not just Auschwitz, most of the doctors went back to Germany after the war and returned to their practices. There's yet another set of photos that have only recently come to the fore. And I don't usually need many notes, but I occasionally do. In this set of photos, there was a rest and recreation facility about 15 miles away from Auschwitz. It was called Solahuta. And here you see one of the very few existing photos that absolutely places Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz. These photos only came to the public knowledge about 10 years. You have the camp commandant there, and you have Frieda Kaffer there, who is next to the right. And it was his photo album. Mengele escaped. Bear said that he knew nothing of what was going on, and the Hoffer, who was the owner of the album, actually returned to Germany and took up his position again at the bank where he worked. You have to understand, and excuse my cynicism, you have to understand that from the point of view of these SS officers and SS women who were auxiliaries, they had a difficult job. And so they had this place where they could come sing and relax. In fact, these photographs were taken within days of the Sonderkommando photos that were taken from the crematoria. As the summer of 1944 passed into the fall at Auschwitz, the Russian army came closer and closer, and the Germans began destroying. The last of the transports, I believe, arrived in Auschwitz in November of 1944, and they began blowing up the crematoria and the gas chamber, trying to destroy any evidence, because they knew that the Russians were going to capture Auschwitz. But before that took place, I think that there were perhaps 70,000 inmates, and Auschwitz was used not just as an extermination camp. There were manufacturing plants, particularly for IG Farben, which was the umbrella company that Bayer at that time was part of. And they had slave laborers. They may have only lived a few months, and they may have been, skeletons, but they had slave laborers. Think about it. You had all these directors of corporations who had degrees from Heidelberg and Göttingen, and all of a sudden, we'll go back a bit, they have available to them tens of thousands of slave laborers that they can hire for pennies a day that they give to the German government. These are highly educated people. Do they ask, where do they come from? No. And in January of 1945, in January 17th, in Auschwitz, they have the death march, and they march prisoners hundreds of miles from Auschwitz to places like Ravensbrück and Mauthausen in order to keep the slave laborers. Again, it's January in Poland, and they have practically nothing on. More than half of the people died on the death march. I asked you all to quiet a little bit on the last piece of music that was played. And that was a lullaby by Gideon Clyde. He was an up-and-coming Czech composer. He was Jewish. He had been deported to Terezin, and Terezin was a different ghetto. It was, quote, the model ghetto, but there was a while where there was a very vibrant artistic community there, and he composed numerous works, which he passed on to his sister. But after the Red Cross visited Teresa, he too was deported to Auschwitz. He was selected for labor, and he was a slave laborer at one of the factories. And then January came, and he was put on a forced march. He died somewhere on some small road between Auschwitz and Dachau. No one knows where. So it's 75 years tonight from the day that the Russians liberated this camp. Only 7,000 people were still there when the Russians arrived. You know, this may have been a staged photo, the way I think it's the Iwo Jima flag photo is staged. But even if you look, you say, well, those guys don't look too bad. If you look, they've stuffed their prison uniforms with rags. And these may have been people who only arrived a few months before. This is clearly a Soviet photo because you can see the Cyrillic letters in the stamp in the far corner. This is a Russian photo of the women's barracks. The few people who were left were people who were either too sick or too weak, or hid. And the children, and this, it's such a devastating photo, because what do the children know? Not what's your name, but they know Nummer, schnell. And you see them all putting their arms out. They've never been called by their names. This last photo, you see some Russians and Poles who are helping this person out of what had been the infirmary, perhaps. Many times it's captioned that this is a child who has been rescued. It's not a child. It's an adult. I can't tell for sure. I suspect it may be a man in his 30s. It could be a woman. After you have been living on 200 calories a day for a year, men and women both lose their hair. The Nazis had a term for Jews. It wasn't just Juden. It was Stinkjuden. Filthy Jews. And I have absolutely no doubt that this person here had been living in his or her excrement for weeks. The people at Auschwitz, all of the prisoners had no access to being clean. The very term that the Nazis used to describe Jews, the Nazis themselves had made the Jews that way. Sadly, of the 7,000 people who were liberated, another 1,000 died soon after liberation. They were simply too weak to live. I can only hope that whether this person lived or died, that the very act of liberation was something to close his or her life. And what happened then? What happened? Was there justice? I'm going to say no. There were the Nuremberg trials. I mean, if you look at Hermann Goering in the top left, you could care less what was going on. The very top Nazi officials were condemned, but the vast number of people who made the Holocaust possible not only were not punished, but they went right back to the lives that they led. And so, I think the question has to be, we're here tonight and I thank you. 75 years later, the famous refrain, never again. I'm not sure who said But really what never again means is never shall Jews be murdered in Central Europe in the 1940s. Because the reality of the situation is that genocide has continued ever since the war. I mean, the only thing, all of the people that you saw suffering, the only way that we can honor their suffering is to make sure that it never happens again. And not just in words, but in real action. Here you have pictures of young women who were murdered. 1 million Cambodians were killed in the killing field era of the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s. And then in Bosnia, and I'm old enough, when I saw these pictures coming out of Bosnia, I could not believe it. In the 1990s, it's happening all over again. All over again. And then in Rwanda. And I think it's cowardly to say, oh, well, you know, the Hutus and the Tutsis, they've always hated each other. That's a dodge. That is a dodge. And one of the people who was working in Rwanda at that time, she said about Rwanda, because we had a State Department official who got up in front of the news media and she said, there may be acts of genocide which are taking place in Rwanda. And fortunately, there was one reporter who said, how many acts of genocide does it take to make a genocide? And Alison Deforge, she said, Rwanda is just too far away, too poor, and too black for anyone to care. And so, I would like you to think of these children. I have brought stones that you are free to place where you would like. It is a Jewish tradition to put a stone at the grave of a friend or loved one. And for the millions who died in the Holocaust, they have no grave. And so I would like to ask you, each of you has a short biography of someone. Let me just ask, I'm curious. Those of you who have a little pamphlet of someone who survived, if you looked at yours, did the person that you were reading about, did that person survive? If you have a survivor, would you please stand up? If you were Jewish, this would be the number of survivors from your training. I'd like you to stay standing if you would, please. I would also like, if you're still looking at your pamphlet, as I read out countries, I would like for you to stand as well, if you are able, and only if you're able. I'd like to start with those who have victims from Germany. If your person is from Germany, would you please stand? If the person in your folder is from France, would you stand? If the person in your folder is from Poland, would you stand? The Netherlands? If the person is from Czechoslovakia, or Bohemia, or Moravia? If your person is from Norway? Do I have Romania? There's someone from Romania. Yugoslavia. Greece. Is there someone from Greece? And at this juncture, could I ask anyone else who is able to please stand? I would like to request if Theo Hirschman might come forward. Theo is going to say Kaddish. Kaddish is said many times in the Jewish faith, but it's also said as a mourner's Kaddish for those who have died. And in addition to the fact that the millions who were killed in the Holocaust have no final resting place, they never had anyone to say Kaddish. So would you please?
יתברך וישתבח ויתואר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי קדושה ברכו לעילם מכל ברכתה שיבתה ותשבחתה ונחמתה כמדומיה בנבוא אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל בנבוא אמן. I just want to add, this is not Hebrew. The prayer is in Aramaic, and it comes from the Babylonian period when the Jewish community thrived there until 1948. And the scholars developed this prayer, which was said after every time they finished a certain lesson, and they extolled the name and praised God for being able to do that. And later, in the mid-1400s, it became part of a prayer said after by the mourners during the services that they went to.
Thank you.
There is an English translation, and it isn't here. This is taken literally, but there is one to make it understood a little better. Let the glory of God be extolled. Let the glory of God be extolled. Let God's great name be hallowed in the world, whose creation God willed. May God's rule soon prevail in our own day, our own lives, and the life of all Israel. And let us say, Amen. Let God's great name be blessed forever and ever. Let the name of the Holy One, blessed One, be glorified, extolled, and honored. Though God is beyond all praises, songs, and adorations that we can utter, and let us say, Amen. For us and for all Israel, may the blessing of peace and the promise of life come true, and let us say, Amen. May the one who causes peace to reign in the high heavens, let peace descend on us, on all Israel, and all world, and let us say, Amen.
I would thank you. I would like to ask everyone, do you have someone in your family who was lost?
All of the Gangers, my relatives that did not come over to America were lost. I have the list of you. think there was like 100 of them.
Does anyone else have someone, please, who they would like to speak in honor? Thank you very much. I'm grateful that you came tonight. I would prefer that there not be any applause, if that is possible, please. I don't think applause is appropriate at this juncture.
But thank you.
You're welcome. And there'll be time for questions and discussion for the next half hour if you would like. But you're free to go as well. Thank you again.
I thought you might be here, but I didn't see you. Oh, dear. They were on the floor. We've been almost everywhere.
You too. We'll get up there someday. Yeah, we'll give you a call.
Okay.